Today's video is being done in collaboration with Rewriting History. After watching this video, be sure to check out his take on the question we're addressing as well. After the First World War, France was a victorious but exhausted power, traumatized by the fact that the majority of combat during the Western Front of the Great War took place on French soil, just miles from the French capital, all while the country itself was locked in a defensive battle of material economics. The Great War had killed approximately 1.36 million young Frenchmen and wounded over 4 million, producing the hollow years of the 1930s, in which the pool of available conscripts was cut in half. Patriotism itself lost much of its magic, and a pacifist backlash led the French public to recoil from any prospect of another industrial slaughter. All of this crippled a political system already predisposed to paralysis. The French Third Republic was set up to be dominated by the legislature, which produced a merry-go-round of ministries, a total of 10 different governments in less than 3 years, between early 1930 and late 1933 alone, while social polarization deepened into what one observer called a pitiless civil war. The Stavitsky financial scandal of 1934, a major embezzlement and bribery scheme centered around a Ukrainian French financier who cost the French millions of francs in worthless, fraudulent bonds before mysteriously dying, triggered bloody riots in the Place de la Concorde that left 15 dead and nearly even toppled the government. Then, the 1936 victory of Léon Blum's Popular Front catalyzed the right wing, producing the possibly apocryphal but widely repeated slogan, "Better Hitler than Blum," among those who preferred the political positions of German National Socialism to what they called Blum's socialist-adjacent Bolshevism. On the radical right, political leagues outside of the government rejected the parliamentary system in favor of a more authoritarian option. Action François under Charles Maurras supplied an intellectual core of a monarchist, Catholic, and rabidly anti-republican nationalist movement. The Croix de Feu under Colonel de la Roque likewise grew into a mass veterans movement, with what looked like paramilitary forces before its eventual suppression and reconstitution as a conventional political party, the Parti Social François. Anti-Semitism was also widespread, and now combined traditional anti-socialism and Catholicism with the belief that Jews were a parasitic foreign group draining resources from French society. This was not helped by the economic situation of the period. The Great Depression struck comparatively late in France, but still struck hard, with national income falling by roughly 30%, while various governments clung to deflation and the gold standard, hobbling along as they constructed the Maginot Line, which was a massive defensive perimeter along the border with Germany. The Maginot Line absorbed resources which might have been used elsewhere to stabilize the economy, all while French diplomacy similarly became entangled in an elaborate web of alliances with Eastern European nations, which France lacked the capacity to honor, just as their dependence on the reluctant British continued to deepen. By the late 1930s, the French Republic's survival was, to many, actually a question up for debate. The riots already showed that a determined mobilization of the Leagues could bring tens of thousands into the streets and paralyze the government. It was only the army's reluctance to fire on the veterans of the Great War and the League's own lack of coordination that kept it from becoming a coup. And all of these various pressures began to tear apart the Popular Front coalition by 1938. France was, by every metric, on the brink. But only a year later, following the German invasion of Poland, the Second World War broke out, and France was overrun by the revolutionary machine of lightning warfare, or blitzkrieg. But what if all of that had changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, France was fascist? Before beginning today's alternate history scenario, be sure to leave a comment and subscribe. We're currently trying to reach our goal of 50,000 subscribers in 2026, and every little bit helps the channel out. If you want to help support our content, you can watch through our extensive catalog of videos, or consider supporting your Legion like our generous channel members. Thank you, and enjoy the video. For starters, we must make some major changes to produce a fascist France. The French radical right never lacked numbers or presence, as we just laid out. It didn't even necessarily lack funding. Its primary obstacle was basically unity. Action François under Charles Maurras was intellectual, but it was born of the anti-Dreyfusard reaction of the 1890s, and thus had influence in papers and books and the salons, but was politically a dead end, because restorationist monarchism really had no realistic path to power in a country that hadn't seriously entertained the idea of a monarchy since 1870. The Croix de Feu, which later became the Parti Social François, led by Colonel François de la Roque, was the right's political giant by sheer numbers, and by 1936 it was plausibly the largest political organization in the country's history, with a huge base among those Great War veterans. The PSF did something unique, however. It united the Catholic middle class, members of the working class, and the rural notables under one banner. Its problem was its leader. De la Roque was very much a legalist. In February of 1934, when the other right-wing leagues fought battles with police at the Place de la Concorde, he held his columns in reserve and never escaped the accusations of cowardice that followed. Essentially, he did not want to take power by revolution, which prevented his massive movement from ever taking power at all. More radical than the PSF was the Parti Populaire François, the PPF, led by Jacques Doriot. The PPF was smaller but sharper edged than the PSF, mostly because Jacques Doriot was the former communist mayor of Saint-Denis. Thus, when he broke violently from the left to the right, he brought with him a working class following that gave the PPF street credibility. Doriot had the temperament for a coup that de la Roque lacked, but not the numbers to attempt one alone. Now, beneath the monarchists and these two major nationalist factions was a scattering of smaller groups, like the Jeunesse Patriots and Solidarité Françoise, blue-shirted street leagues dependent on rich patrons, and also Francisme, which was the most nakedly Italian in its imitation of Mussolini's black shirts, and the least significant in its reach. But below all of them, invisible to most of the public until it was too late, was La Cagole, or the Comité Secret d'Action Révolutionnaire, a secret, well-armed group led by the politician Eugène Delonclet that had no mass base at all, but was the only one of these groups actually prepared for an armed coup of the state, which we'll get to in a moment. First, we have to address the issue of unity. To allow these movements to coalesce into one bigger fascist movement, we'll first assume that the heavy industrialists and financiers, who were the patrons of these various competing right-wing parties, are rattled even more deeply by three factors: the 1936 industry nationalizations carried out by the Popular Front government, the Matignon wage settlements, which also recognized trade unions, and the wave of factory occupations that followed it. A more fearful reaction would allow these patrons to begin to consider the need for a united front against the left-wing government in power, and to begin conditioning their support on the basis that the leagues cease their infighting. Eugene Schuler, the founder of the cosmetics giant L'Oréal, who in our own timeline bankrolled and sheltered La Cagole, is the plausible node for this, along with the broader steel, rail, and finance lobbies. And crucially, none of this requires, for example, de la Roque and the PSF, nor Doriot and the PPF to like each other. It only really requires them to need the same money. What this means is that de la Roque is by necessity politically outflanked. He is boxed in by the patrons demanding a united right, a discredited parliamentary centre, and Doriot's PPF visibly willing to act where his PSF hesitates. So we'll assume that, as a result of these pressures for the sake of our scenario, de la Roque brings his enormous membership into a new coalition, a national front, to actively counter the Popular Front government, and crucially, to produce a coalition that has the PSF's numbers and respectability with the PPF's teeth and muscle. It is certainly a marriage of convenience, but one that can now win. Our second change is a bit less realistic, but necessary, and that is that the League dissolution decree passed by the Popular Front government isn't fully enforced. The real decree in June of 1936 dissolved the paramilitary leagues, forcing the PSF to reform as an ordinary electoral party. In this timeline, if we assume the enforcement is patchier, and perhaps sympathetic prefects and police look the other way in enough departments, then our new national front, especially the PPF wing of it, will be able to retain an unofficial paramilitary structure alongside its legal party apparatus, which will likewise maintain the sort of street pressure the Italian fascists and German National Socialist movements used when taking power. On paper, they would be a political movement like any other, and in practice, they would still have something albeit something smaller to mobilize with on the street. Our third, and arguably most important change, is that the La Cagoule conspiracy partially works. You see, La Cagoule had stockpiled weapons, cultivated sympathizers inside the army and police, and despite their small size, were prepared to manufacture a crisis that could lead to a coup, a terror attack on French soil, and they were going to blame it on the Communist Party. Historically, by 1937, the sitting chamber was still nominally a left-wing Popular Front majority, but no new elections were scheduled in short order. The government was plagued by ongoing strikes and the political rebellion of the Radical Party, who was not only the ruling party after Léon Blum's resignation, but also, ironically, a more moderate center-left member of the coalition, which was acting increasingly hostile and distant to its own further left-wing allies within the front. And thus, on, of all days, September 11th, 1937, Cagoule operatives carried out an attack and bombed the offices of two employers' associations on the Rue des Presbourg and the Rue des Bossières. The attacks were initially blamed on the Communist Party, just as the plan expected. However, in our own history, the police raided Cagoule arms caches across the country and arrested much of the network, exposing the plot early on. If we assume, however, that the police never conclusively tied the bombings to La Cagoule rather than the Communist Party, then this conspiracy of terror centered on the communists would remain a widespread fear, and the communists were, importantly, a part of the Popular Front government in power. The Popular Front would have already been facing strikes and uncooperative center-left, and now this bombing crisis. And the National Front, which we have created, would be through all of this unscathed political outsiders, specifically ones who could use this attack to their own political advantage. This pressure would build and build until, just as in our own history, on March 10th, 1938, the French government would be completely paralyzed. On this date in our own history, Prime Minister Camille Chatemps had just resigned after the Socialist and Communist parties refused to grant the Popular Front government special financial decree powers. This resignation came only 2 days before German troops entered and annexed Austria. By March 13th, Léon Blum had returned to power to install a new cabinet, which of course collapsed within a month when the Senate refused it emergency financial powers. But this, more importantly, meant that France spent the entirety of the Anschluss Crisis ruled by a caretaker administration. However, in our scenario, that vacuum of political power could be filled by a completely different and much more explosive alternative. The aforementioned center-left Radical Party would be witnessing simultaneous domestic and foreign crises at a time when the domestic politics were already even more violently unstable than our own history, and thus, for the sake of our scenario, we'll assume they will fully break away from the Popular Front and quickly form a government of national union, rather than another caretaker government. This union government might plausibly be led by a figure like Édouard Daladier, who took power after the crisis in our own history, since the historical Daladier was already drifting toward exactly this kind of order-first pragmatic politics, cooperation with the right and the left just to get things back under control. But because of the new conditions we've set up here, regardless of who's in control, the government would need the support of other major political factions to take over, from the center, like Alliance Démocratique or some of the smaller Republican parties, but also, pragmatically, the National Front. That means conceding positions in the cabinet to members of the National Front. Delaroque could, for example, take the Ministry of the Interior, and Doriot could be given a security or labor mobilization brief suited to breaking the strike wave, and so on and so forth. The government which would thus be established would look like ordinary parliamentary horse trading, a broad coalition of right-wing, center, and center-left forces granted decree powers to handle these massive national emergencies, which was exactly the kind of government Édouard Daladier historically would receive much later in April 1938. But behind the scenes, over the following 12 to 18 months, as Delaroque and Doriot used their new decree powers in that ministry to marginalize the nominal center-left leadership, the Government of National Union would become, in practice, the National Front's government. This coup, such as it is, would happen in slow motion and largely on paper, though backed by both the necessities of managing the escalating crisis in Eastern Europe and a network of wealthy financiers and street gangsters ready to cause chaos should the Radical Party not comply. This new government would also be able to fulfill exactly the kind of outcome the National Front's industrial patrons would have wanted from it, with the Communist Party bearing the brunt of the consequences. Using the still unresolved bombing panic as pretext, de la Rocque's ministry could expand the surveillance lists beyond their pre-war scope, and even move to ban the Communist Party entirely. The wider non-communist left and its aligned unions and newspapers would likewise face selective, legally cloaked harassment, though not formal dissolution. Now, rather than repealing the Popular Front policies of the 40-hour work week and paid vacations, which none of the coalition, de la Rocque least of all, would want blamed on them, the government would follow something close to the path Paul Reynaud actually took as finance minister from November 1938, which was decree laws that extended hours and loosened restrictions in the name of national defense without repealing the underlying laws. The National Front elements of the government would also, of course, go further than Reynaud ever did, because now they have something Reynaud never had, an interior ministry willing to break strikes rather than negotiate. And what this means is that we could even see a structure where independent unions are folded into a new national labor front, in which industrialists keep authority over their own workforces in exchange for accepting state direction of production. This is something adjacent to corporatism, once again implemented in the fog of crisis measures in response to the perceived German aggression after the Anschluss, but not exactly fascism yet. On the deeper economic question, which is whether to adopt deflationary orthodoxy or directed rearmament spending, the crisis would essentially settle the argument once again in favor of the emergency. Many of the financiers who bankrolled the National Front's unification would have preferred to defend the franc and protect their own savings. But a government that has really been created in response to the Anschluss crisis and the bombing panic cannot really decline to rearm for fear of upsetting the gold bloc. France would by necessity rearm, and fast, and the decree powers that let de la Rocque break strikes would also let him do this, a more radical version of the pivot Reynaud himself made historically, under a government which does not want to wait to militarize. The one place they would move cautiously would be the army's senior leadership. Purging, for example, Chief of the General Staff of National Defense Maurice Gamelin would risk the institutional confrontation the National Front has otherwise avoided by working through existing structures. They would instead have to elevate the armored warfare faction which Gamelin's doctrine had sidelined for a decade. Ironically, Charles de Gaulle's 1934 case for concentrated mechanized divisions would find far more receptive audience here, along with much of his other military theater, with this new government eager to prove its martial credentials against the decadence it would blame on the previous ones. Of course, Gamelin would remain influential, and the reforms certainly would be incomplete, and French industry would still need time to build the tanks and radios this new doctrine would call for. But over about 18 months, this could produce a meaningfully different army than the one that existed in our own history. Now, the government might also eventually begin drafting its own Statut des Juifs, substantively close to the one Vichy would pass in October 1940, except here on its own initiative, defining Jewish identity by race and excluding it from the civil service, the officer corps, and eventually the professions. We have to remember the broader political movement here had spent a decade blaming Jews for the country's decline, and now actually holds the ministries that could act on this. The only question here would really be how much influence the non-right-wing parties in the coalition have by this point to restrict such a policy move, or if they would be willing to do so at all. Regardless, this government, composed of many parties built on vigorous anti-communism, would also make some immediate changes to French foreign policy, starting with the 1935 Franco-Soviet Mutual Assistance Pact. It was almost meaningless, even under the Popular Front, so repudiating it costs France little real deterrent value, but does give Stalin one more reason to conclude the Western powers won't stand with him against Hitler, reinforcing the logic that led him toward the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The most interesting question, however, is that of Mussolini's Italy. Mussolini sought an alliance with France and Britain in the early 1930s at the Stressaw Conference, born of his fear of German expansionism and his political alliance with Austrian Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss, who was assassinated by Austrian Nazis and was vehemently opposed to Anschluss. However, Mussolini's talks with Britain and France were poisoned when he invaded Ethiopia, which caused Western sanctions to be levied against him. Mussolini also, by this point in the scenario, would have watched a German rearming of the Rhineland go unchallenged, and would have already declared the Rome-Berlin Axis, and sent troops to fight alongside German units in the Spanish Civil War, and joined the Anti-Comintern Pact. He is by this point already deep in the German orbit, even if he is not yet locked in, as the Pact of Steel, the actual military alliance between Italy and Germany, wouldn't have been signed until May of 1939. That leaves this government 14 months after its establishment to decide which direction Italy would go, and whether this new government in France might reignite Mussolini's ambition for a Latin Axis, incorporating the Spanish as well. The big issue is that Mussolini's and broader Italian opportunism cuts both directions. Italy abandoned the Triple Alliance for the Entente in 1915, and then found itself bitterly resentful toward those same powers over its so-called mutilated victory. Mussolini himself employed this sacro egoismo, or sacred self-interest doctrine, constantly. But the more time and resources he sinks into fighting the Spanish Civil War with Germany and aligning Italy's economy and military with the Germans, the higher the cost of switching sides will again grow. More structurally, France and Italian interests actually collided independent of ideology. Mussolini's irredentist claims on Tunisia, Corsica, Nice, and Savoy could simply never be conceded, least of all, by a fervently nationalist French government. What is plausible, however, if not an alliance between France and Italy, is transactional diplomacy. France could recognize the Italian conquest of Ethiopia, as Britain itself did in April 1938, and offer Colonial or Suez Canal Company concessions in exchange for a price-tagged Italian declaration of neutrality, preventing Italy from signing the Pact of Steel. After all, this National Front government does have the ideological language to talk to Mussolini's Italy in a language they understand. But really, the most likely outcome of all of this is making Mussolini a very expensive fence-sitter. Rather than choosing between the Axis and the Allies, he could do what Spanish dictator Francisco Franco actually did historically, and stay formally non-belligerent toward France and Britain, while still sending an expeditionary force east to fight the Soviets alongside the Wehrmacht. This gets Mussolini nearly everything he actually wants. He can be a credible anti-Bolshevik and bleed his troops to get a seat, even if it's a relatively small one, at the post-war table, while continuing to hedge some Axis sympathy, all without wagering his fleet or his African empire against the French and British. Now, all of this brings us inevitably to Munich in September of 1938, which, in our own history, practically gave Czechoslovakia to Hitler. This government in France, though, which has spent 6 months sort of building its legitimacy on nationalism, cannot be seen doing what Daladier historically did at Munich and trade the Sudetenland for a promise of peace. And thus, it won't. When the crisis peaks, the National Front would hold its commitment to Czechoslovakia and mobilize, which would force the British to panically follow suit, and force Hitler to choose between backing down and invading against odds his own general staff considered unfavorable. Hitler's ideological core was predicated on the acquisition of Lebensraum, or living space, for the German people. He was also convinced, as both Mein Kampf and his second book argued, that France was Germany's irreconcilable enemy. But Hitler predicated a lot of his riskier action on the conviction that Western democracies were weak and would continue appeasement, which has been slightly broken here, especially with this much more ideologically rigid France. And every one of Hitler's foreign policy wins up to this point, from the Rhineland to Anschluss, and most of its wins in our own history building up to the invasion of Poland, also shared a major variable. They were executed before anyone else could organize a response. But now, the response has been organized, and Germany's west wall, the Siegfried Line, is barely complete, with barely a dozen reserve divisions facing around 90 mobilized French ones over the border. The Wehrmacht also lacked the ammunition, fuel reserves, armor, and manpower required to fight France, Britain, and Czechoslovakia together. And Hitler's generals knew this. Ludwig Beck resigned as chief of the German General Staff 1 month before, specifically over this dispute, and General Hans Oster, along with others in the Abwehr, or the German military intelligence, had a real contingency plan to assassinate Hitler in the event that he ordered an invasion the Western Allies were actually prepared to resist. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's continuation of the appeasement policy at Munich in our own history removed the plotters' pretext before they had time to act. However, a France that doesn't hand Hitler that off-ramp puts the question back in front of them. We also know from the aforementioned assassination of Engelbert Dollfuss that Hitler's resolve was not invincible. When Mussolini mobilized 4 Italian divisions on the border with Austria within days, Hitler folded and immediately disavowed the plotters and let Austria remain independent for another 4 years. So, in this scenario, Hitler would probably back down. But he still needs a mechanism to save face, because Hitler has spent 5 years building a myth of unbroken triumph and absolutely cannot simply announce that he's practically lost a staring contest. In this scenario, that mechanism would probably be the same one that produced the real Munich Agreement, because it was Mussolini, in fact, not even Chamberlain, who first floated the idea of a 4-power conference to defuse the crisis. In this timeline, Mussolini has every reason to play that role again, and for a self-interested one too, because Italy's own rearmament is still nowhere near finished. So brokering a face-saving peace lets him extract value from both sides who both seek to court him into their camps, while avoiding a war he isn't ready for. Mussolini's conference this time around would be much thinner than the real Munich Agreement, because there is no French delegation willing to simply hand over the Sudetenland. Instead, we might actually see something closer to what Chamberlain himself had floated earlier in the crisis and abandoned: an internationally supervised plebiscite in the Sudeten districts, which is heavily conditional and lets Hitler claim self-determination for ethnic Germans as a diplomatic win, without an actual annexation, while Czechoslovakia's core state and the credibility of France's alliance commitments both survive intact. Publicly, it isn't a defeat for Hitler, but everyone who matters, from his own general staff to the Italians, the British, the French, and Hitler himself, know what happened. Hitler was prepared to invade, was told by his own officers it would likely fail, and blinked. The myth of an unbroken string of bloodless triumphs, which was central to his unchallenged domestic authority, would see its first real crack. This also means that the arms race both sides had been running since March would accelerate through the winter rather than pause, and whatever comes next, over Danzig, Poland, or some other flashpoint entirely, would come to a Germany that has just been shown for the first time since 1934 that someone is actually willing to call their bluff. War is still, by necessity, essentially inevitable, though. For the sake of simplicity, we will assume it still erupts over an invasion of Poland in September of 1939. The difference here is in what follows those declarations of war. Historically, France's response to the invasion of Poland was almost embarrassingly restrained. They launched a limited advance into the Saarland on a 15-mile front, taking a handful of evacuated villages, before it was called off entirely once Poland fell in early October. Then the army settled in behind the Maginot Line for 8 months before Germany launched its invasion. It's one of the more debated missed opportunities of the war, as Germany, again, had perhaps 24 divisions in the west that September, many of them second-line reservist formations, facing up to 7 French divisions, while virtually all of the Wehrmacht's panzer and motorized strength was tied down in Poland. General Franz Halder's own diary entries from the period showed he possessed real anxiety that a serious French push could have broken the German position in the West before it was ever properly built. Our alternate National Front government ideologically will thus not let the so-called phony war in the West ever manifest. They cannot sit behind concrete fortifications while Poland is dismembered without undercutting the entire premise of their own legitimacy. So this timeline's Saar offensive is a real one. It will be a sustained push, still cautious in General Gamelin's hands as he remains institutionally influential and by his nature the same careful officer he always was, but this push would be pressed far further and held far longer, contesting the unfinished West Wall. This offensive would stall well short of anything decisive, especially because France doesn't yet have the logistics or doctrine for a war-ending drive into the Rhineland, but it does force Germany to actually fight in the West when it can least afford to. The winter of 1939 to 1940 would be a slow, continuous border war and costly for both sides. The main German offensive, when it finally comes, would arrive well past its historical May 1940 date, partly from the same weather and readiness problems that pushed Hitler's own generals to postpone it repeatedly in our own history, and partly because the Wehrmacht now needs real time to disengage from a live fight and redeploy. Now, the advantages that won Germany the Battle of France in 1940 were never really about numbers or firepower, as the Allies had more of both. They were about tempo and initiative, and in particular, the German army's Auftragstaktik doctrine of decentralized decision-making, which let columns exploit gaps the moment they opened, rather than waiting for orders to catch up. None of that changes here, but even in its retreat, this French army, with more of its armor concentrated into de Gaulle-style divisions, rather than parceled out to infantry support, can put up a good fight. It likely doesn't stop a German breakthrough at Sedan through the Ardennes, but French counterattacks, which in our own history came too late and in too small a force to matter, would happen here on a larger scale and land harder, even if they won't land quite hard enough to reverse the breakthrough. Hitler's campaign to conquer France would be measured in months rather than weeks, costlier for the Wehrmacht, more contested at every river line, but it would nonetheless result in a German victory in the field, because 18 months of doctrine reform was never going to fully undo a decade of institutional flaws. But the settlement after Germany wins would also change. In our own history, Philippe Pétain sought an armistice in June of 1940 because he believed the war was unwinnable and thought that collaboration with the Nazis was the pragmatic course. De la Roque and Doriot believe neither of those things, and couldn't even admit so if they did by the nature of their ideological rule. There would be no surrender, and as metropolitan France falls under German military occupation, with no negotiated zones and no puppet administration to dress it up, the National Front government would relocate to Algiers, taking the fleet, the colonial army, and the industrial resources of French North and West Africa with it. One other question to address is Italy's entry. Mussolini's actual decision to enter the war was still a form of opportunism. Even after Italy signed the Pact of Steel in May 1939, Mussolini kept Italy out of the invasion of Poland entirely, declaring non-belligerency and handing Hitler a long, deliberately unmeetable list of war materials as an excuse to stay home. Italy didn't actually enter the war until June 1940, which was only after France was already visibly collapsing, purely to claim a cheap seat at the peace table. Mussolini's own private justification for entering at all was that he needed a few thousand Italian soldiers dead to have a claim on the spoils. But none of the conditions that produced that decision exist in a friendlier form here. Italy in this timeline either hasn't signed the Pact of Steel at all, or has signed something considerably less gratuitous to Germany, given the period our National Front France has spent attempting to court Mussolini. Italian rearmament is still as unfinished as it was historically, and here there is no cheap opportunistic entry point to exploit. France isn't collapsing in 6 weeks here. It's fighting a long, costly, unresolved war through the winter, which is the kind of long-term commitment Mussolini's whole foreign policy was built to avoid. He has every reason to keep extracting value from both sides by staying out, and none of the reasons that got him into the war historically. Thus, Italy probably either stays neutral or continually non-belligerent, not necessarily forever, but for the duration of the Western campaign at minimum. Additionally, as a result of their flight to Algeria, the French fleet would survive intact and stay in the fight. Historically, the French Navy's fate after the armistice was up in the air, and the British actually attacked it at Mers el-Kebir in July of 1940, rather than risk it falling under German or Vichy control. None of that, again, has any reason to happen here. A government that never signs an armistice never puts its own fleet in ambiguous hands, and thus the Marine Nationale sails to Algiers as a fully committed Allied asset from day one, giving the Allies a larger Mediterranean naval presence. French North Africa is also never divided. Historically, the region spent 1940 through to 1942 under Vichy control, and Vichy French troops actually fought against the Allied torch landings in November 1942, before a ceasefire was arranged. Here, there's no Vichy to begin with, so there's no need for any Allied invasion of North Africa. North and West Africa are simply already unified, mobilized, and Allied territory from the moment the National Front government in exile arrives. Overall, this is a stronger, earlier, more coherent Allied position in the Mediterranean than the historical one ever assembled, and even more of a deterrent to keep Mussolini out of the war. In particular, an Italy that never actually enters the war, at least the war in the West, is a bigger structural change than it first looks, because so much of the war's actual shape in 1940 and 41 was downstream of Mussolini's own decisions. there's no Italian invasion of Egypt from Libya in September 1940, which means no desert war for Britain to fight there, which means no German Africa Corps sent to rescue a collapsing Italian position, which means that Rommel's North African campaign, as we know it, doesn't happen at all. Those German divisions would instead be sent to the east to fight the Soviets. The divisions themselves would be a fairly modest addition to Germany's eventual Operation Barbarossa, a couple of extra panzer formations out of the roughly 19 committed to the invasion. The bigger effect here, rather, stems from the campaign that Italy's absence prevents from happening at all, which was Mussolini's disastrous invasion of Greece in October of 1940, which was pushed back into Albania within weeks, forcing Hitler to rescue him the following April with a full invasion of both Yugoslavia and Greece, a campaign that, combined with the airborne assault on Crete in May, cost Germany several irreplaceable weeks and gutted its parachute divisions so badly that large-scale airborne operations were essentially never attempted again. That Balkan detour is one of the more widely cited reasons that Operation Barbarossa launched on June 22nd rather than its original mid-May target. And the missing 5 or 6 weeks mattered, as Army Group Center was still fighting at the gates of Moscow when the autumn rains and then the brutal winter arrived, with fresh Siberian divisions that were freed once Soviet intelligence confirmed Japan would not attack in the east, arriving just in time to counterattack. With Italy neutral, there's no Greek war and plausibly a much smaller, faster response to the March 1941 Yugoslav coup, with Hitler likely still moving perhaps now through the Hungarians to secure Belgrade and the approach to the Romanian oil fields. It isn't free, though, because the Battle of France would have offset some of what Germany has saved by skipping North Africa and a shorter Balkan campaign, but still, these changes likely get Barbarossa moving closer to its original date, and with more committed raw power. Barbarossa, when it is launched, would undoubtedly be more materially successful in this scenario. However, German logistics still couldn't sustain the drive on Moscow, regardless of the calendar, and by August 1941 its tank and truck fleets were already suffering attrition. German intelligence also badly underestimated Soviet manpower reserves throughout the campaign. Additionally, even if the Germans take Moscow, that was never actually the same thing as winning. Soviet contingency plans already called for relocating its government to Kuibyshev if the capital fell, and with their factories behind the Urals and no real domestic political movement that could pose a serious challenge to Stalin, the Soviets could theoretically stay alive, even with their metaphorical head cut off. Still, 1941 would be much worse for the Soviets. Germany can achieve a cleaner early encirclement in Ukraine, and German airborne and transport assets are still intact rather than spent at Crete. The Eastern Front would still become a grinding multi-year catastrophe the same as it was in our own history. It would just start from a somewhat better position for Germany than our own histories did. In the West, not much changes in the Channel and Atlantic theaters. The Battle of Britain would take place with roughly the same historical shape and timeline, and so would the U-boat war. The one real difference is there's a bit of a slow drain of German resources here. Germany now has to garrison a hostile occupied France against the government in exile, rather than administering a compliant Vichy that policed itself for free. In effect, it's just one more small subtraction from whatever Germany can throw east. Likewise, in the far east, Japan will still likely attack Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, bringing the United States into the war. Japan also still needs French Indochina to cut the Kunming-Haiphong Railway, which was the last significant overland route into the Chinese city of Chongqing, which supplied Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces. Securing French Indochina also meant securing airfields and a staging base for operations further south. However, the mechanism by which Japan gets Indochina will look quite different. Historically, it was mostly diplomatic coercion. The Vichy French Governor-General Georges Cautrois initially tried to resist Japanese pressure, appealing of his own accord to the British for support. But the rest of the Vichy French government essentially sided against him, and thus he had little choice but to close the supply route to China in June 1940 to avoid provoking Japan further. He was dismissed days later specifically for this independent contact with Britain and replaced with the far more accommodating Admiral Jean Decroix, who negotiated Japan's basing rights on paper. There was, however, some fighting that actually followed that September, most notably in the Battle of Lang Son, which was in fact an instance of Japanese field commanders exceeding their orders as a contest of wills, a fact that Japan formally apologized to Vichy France for in the days afterward. In this scenario, however, the National Front government in exile will almost certainly keep the railway open as long as they physically can, since capitulating to intimidation is, again, the kind of weakness this regime cannot show. That means Japan doesn't get its 1940 settlement through coercion. It has to actually take Tonkin by force against a garrison that isn't under orders to fold. The French government, again, cannot physically reinforce a colony on the other side of the world against Japanese naval superiority, so the ultimate outcome is probably still Japanese control, but it would be reached only after a real sustained campaign rather than a short border skirmish followed by an accommodating handover. That has an effect on the wider war in China, because every extra week the Kunming-Haiphong line stays open under French control is another stretch of material reaching Chongqing during precisely the 1940 and 1941 window when Japan was trying to choke that route off to support its own offensive against nationalist forces in Guangxi. It wouldn't change the overall trajectory of the Sino-Japanese War, which was already grinding toward a stalemate regardless, but it can perhaps buy Chiang Kai-shek's forces a little bit more time. By 1942, however, the Eastern Front would still be the main event, grinding towards Stalingrad, and the Italian Expeditionary Force, assuming it is committed there, would still be destroyed in Operation Little Saturn in December of 1942, which was the domestic wound Mussolini would have been waiting to cash in. During this period, the most crucial element to an eventual Allied resurgence would be coming from the United States and the Lend-Lease program. Lend-Lease covered any nation whose defense President Franklin D. Roosevelt deemed vital to American security, which was why the United States sent massive quantities of trucks, airplanes, food supplies, weapons, ammunition, and other material to the Soviet Union under Stalin from October 1941 onward, even in spite of America's deep discomfort with Soviet communism. That precedent establishes that pure realpolitik, and not ideology, govern the Lend-Lease decisions. And on pure realpolitik, this National Front government is a far more attractive partner than the historical Free French ever were. De Gaulle, in our own history, only commanded a few thousand volunteers and no sovereign territory worth mentioning, which is why Roosevelt treated him as an annoyance, and even tried to court the Vichy government diplomatically through 1942, and later cut a notorious deal with Admiral François Darlan in North Africa purely because Darlan could deliver order that de Gaulle couldn't. But in our scenario, the National Front government has never stopped being the government. And again, it has its full fleet, colonial army, functioning bureaucracy, currency, and legitimacy. So aid from the United States to the French can actually be expected to flow earlier and in greater quantities than it did historically, and to flow toward a specific purpose, re-equipping an already enormous colonial manpower pool from France's North African, West African, and Levantine troops on top of whatever escaped metropolitan units made it out. These troops would be armed with American tanks, trucks, and aircraft, and be preparing for a final showdown to reclaim control over continental France. The American press, Congress, and the Jewish lobby might generate controversy over this decision, just as the anti-communists in Congress grumbled over the arming of the Soviets, but the French fleet and manpower are too valuable to lose. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, notably, probably would have an easier time dealing with the French government rather than Roosevelt, as he's already made peace with stranger bedfellows. And without a Mers el-Kebir in this timeline's history to poison the well, Anglo-French naval relations will be much less hostile. Now, in Italy, Mussolini's semi-non-belligerence has also removed the main threat to his rule. In our own history, on July 25, 1943, Mussolini was removed because of the Allied invasion of Sicily. His own Grand Council and the King moved against him because the war had physically arrived on Italian soil. That invasion doesn't exist here, since Italy was never belligerent against the Western Allies. There will still be political pressure against Mussolini, but driven by the failures in the East and economic issues, which critically is nothing major enough to trigger a German occupation of the North, or an Italian rump state like we saw in our own history. Italy could, at this point, slide toward Franco-style neutrality without the brutal civil war Italy actually suffered until 1945, which is, to be fair, a better outcome for ordinary Italians in this timeline than the one they actually got. The bigger question in 1943 is what happens to the resources that historically went into the North African and Italian campaigns, which is nearly 2 years' worth of Anglo-American manpower and shipping. They can't actually go to an early operation resembling D-Day, at least not this early on, because the historical bottleneck for the D-Day landings was landing craft, specifically LSTs, which the British and Americans didn't have enough on, and that was a production line problem tied to shipbuilding allocation, not something we can necessarily fix by moving resources from one theater to another. So I don't think the lack of an Italy campaign simply means D-Day happens in 1943. But what it does mean is that the American planners who wanted a direct 1943 cross-channel assault are going to have an argument reinforced. Churchill's argument, which talked them out of it, was that Italy was the soft underbelly of Europe. But here, Italy isn't an option. These American planners will want a D-Day, and they'll want it as soon as possible, which, by the nature of landing craft production, would probably end up being roughly the same June 1944 date of our own history. There are significant differences in how this landing looks, however, and whether or not it's backed up by a simultaneous invasion of southern France. First, in our own history, Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France, came 2 months after D-Day, and was an afterthought announced in principle at a diplomatic meeting in Tehran, then fought over for months between Churchill, who wanted it cancelled in favor of pushing further into Italy, and the Americans, who wanted the port of Marseille. Operation Dragoon was starved of landing craft because of the Italy campaign, but by this point, the United States had shifted production to supply craft for D-Day, which was why that operation was able to occur at the scale it did. In this alternate timeline, without an Italy campaign, those Mediterranean craft will go to Operation Dragoon, or perhaps larger D-Day. And crucially, the existing French army and their powerful fleet staged in North Africa can be used for the operation. That implies something vastly larger than the historical Operation Dragoon, and likely one simultaneous with the D-Day landing rather than 2 months late, which matters operationally because a two-front German dilemma on D-Day itself is a much worse problem for the Wehrmacht than they had to fight in our own history. Second, there's actually a logistics argument for the South outpacing the North. The northern city of, I'm going to butcher this like I've butchered everything so far, Cherbourg en Cotentin, in Brittany, was deliberately wrecked by a German demolition before its capture, and thus took weeks to become useful for the Allies. The Belgian city of Antwerp also wasn't operational until late November 1944, and so the southern French cities of Marseille and Toulon, by contrast, historically became huge intact logistical assets almost immediately once Dragoon took them, because German garrison forces in southern France were thinner in number and less prepared for a serious assault than the Atlantic Wall garrisons in the northwest. If, alongside the Americans, the National Front throws its whole fleet and colonial army at the Provence region, then the Rhone River corridor toward the city of Lyon could open up faster than the drip feed of soldiers and supplies through Normandy did historically. However, the argument can be made both ways, as, on the other hand, Germany has had since 1940 to think about exactly this threat. Again, historically, the Mediterranean coast was only occupied and fortified from late 1942, giving the Wehrmacht under 2 years to build anything serious there, which is a real part of why it was comparatively soft. But here, a hostile French army has been visibly staged across the water in Algiers since the fall of metropolitan France. We thus have to expect Germany to have actually invested in a real Mediterranean wall over those years. This means it might not actually be as much of a walk in the park, but regardless, the advantage, especially with this two-front invasion, is still on the side of the Allies. But I think the most interesting question all of this presents us is the political question. De Gaulle historically had to fight for every scrap of recognition. He was kept out of D-Day planning entirely, and had to essentially beg Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, Dwight D. Eisenhower, for the political favor of letting French divisions lead into Paris ahead of American units. He was subordinated militarily to Eisenhower because his forces were small and dependent on Allied supply. But none of that leverage imbalance exists here. The French government wouldn't need anyone's blessing to be the government of France, and the Americans know the French wouldn't be caught dead traveling any other army into Paris. This means there is a real negotiation, and maybe real friction, over the unified command. We probably wouldn't see full French independence from the overall Allied command, since going it alone without American air and naval support would be reckless, but there would be a much stronger insistence on an independent French operational command for the southern sector, with French generals actually running that front and Operation Dragoon perhaps, rather than reporting up through an American or British chain the way Free French units did. It's also interesting to think about what the interior French resistance looks like here. Historically, it was de Gaullist nationalists and communist-led partisan fighters unified loosely against the Vichy and German occupation. Without Vichy and just naked German military rule in this timeline, that means anyone resisting is implicitly resisting on behalf of the National Front government, which did ban the Communist Party and would very much like its exiled ministers to reassert direct control the moment the Germans leave. So instead, French resistance throughout this war would have looked more like three independent movements. There would be the nationalists loyal to Algiers, a communist-led resistance now likely hostile to both the occupiers and the government waiting to come back, and probably some meaningful group of people who want to resist the Germans without much enthusiasm for who's coming to replace them. Once France is actually liberated, it would not be placed under the Allied military government of occupied territories. President Roosevelt seriously entertained this idea in her own history rather than handing it straight to a French government, and de Gaulle had to preempt it by rushing his own regional commissioners in ahead of Allied forces and printing French-issued currency to deny an Allied occupation any legitimacy. But there's really no one to dispute in this scenario, as the ministries, currency, and prefectural system all already exist and just need to physically be relocated from Algiers back to Paris. The real question would be a subtler and longer one. Does the Anglo-American alliance have either the will or the leverage to shape what this returning National Front government looks like internally? Will they attempt to impose a more liberal government upon France, rather than allow it to exist as this sort of authoritarian, fascist-adjacent polity? I think the honest answer through 1944 and 1945 is mostly no, for the unglamorous reason that, at least following the landings, winning the war against Germany is still the only priority that matters. And there's no functional lever to pull afterward, because unlike Stalin, who needed continued Lend-Lease and diplomatic coordination badly enough that the Allies had some marginal influence, and even then not a lot, this French government won't be nearly as dependent on continued American goodwill as, say, post-war Britain will be. When the great powers meet to construct the post-war order, France would be treated, unlike it was in her own history, as an essential, albeit illiberal, great power. France would claim a permanent United Nations Security Council seat as a sovereign victor with a somewhat intact global empire. It would also serve as a prosecutor in the war crimes trials, even in spite of its own pre-war policies. As for the map the post-war settlement would produce, Austria would likely be sooner re-established with its 1937 borders. Allied occupation would end early with a stronger, unified Western negotiating position forcing earlier Soviet concessions. To the north, Stalin would still demand significant German territory for Poland to compensate for the Soviet absorption of eastern Poland to the Court Zone line. However, again, with a stronger Western negotiating position, Stalin's ability to arbitrarily slice off all of Lower Silesia or parts of Pomerania for Poland is somewhat checked. Czechoslovakia would also be slightly different. They would have entered the war with probably somewhat smaller ethnic German districts already peeled off by consent based on our earlier alternate Munich agreement. That changes the whole post-war question of expelling the Germans, because historically about 3 million Sudeten Germans were expelled in 1945 under the Beneš decrees. A smaller German population by 1945 means a smaller, less internationally controversial expulsion. In the West, we'll also see France start to dictate more than it did in her own history. France pushed hard in 1919 after the First World War for a detached French-aligned Rhineland buffer state, and was overruled by then-American President Woodrow Wilson and British Prime Minister David Lloyd George. Historically, it also administered the Saarland as a protectorate from 1947 until a 1955 referendum sent it back to West Germany. This National Front government arriving at the peace table will have a much stronger hand to refight that 1919 argument, either annexing the Saar rather than merely administering it, or even pushing for permanent international control of the Ruhr Valley rather than the looser arrangement that eventually became the European Coal and Steel Community. Regardless, it's likely that whatever action this France takes produces a much more antagonistic French relationship with a reforming West Germany down the line. Now, without the Italo-Yugoslav wars, as Italy was non-belligerent, Trieste and the Istrian Peninsula would remain firmly inside of Italy. Italy will probably lose its Aegean islands in the Dodecanese to Greece in a negotiated settlement to buy favor with the Allies, but it would retain Italian Africa, both in Libya and the Horn of Africa, and in the same vein, French North Africa would be frozen in place. Algiers served as the wartime capital, and North and West Africa would, for the National Front, be non-negotiable core territories of the French state. The capital in exile arrangement would also have brought its own interesting side effects, because just over 4 years of Algiers functioning as the literal seat of the French government would be a far deeper entanglement of Algeria and metropolitan France than anything our historical French-Algerian relationship ever produced. The ministries, currency, military command structure, and the war economy itself would have depended on Algiers for the duration of the war, which means the Algerian settler elites, the urban notables, and the colonial administrative class would have had real leverage over the state. That cuts two ways for what comes after 1945. It could mean an Algeria more deeply and durably fused to France proper than it ever was historically, with its elites rewarded with real institutional integration for their loyalty. Or it could mean the opposite, a colonial population that tasted proximity to power during the war years and then would find a swift return to second-class administrative status after 1945 even less tolerable than it was historically, sharpening the eventual break. Either way, Algeria would be a much more poignant question for the French to answer in the coming years. Moving east, France's former Levantine territories would be maintained but contested in this timeline. The National Front would want to hold Syria and Lebanon by force, but the rest of the Western Allies were looking to enforce various new arrangements of independent states in the Middle East, including what would become the State of Israel. This could lead to intense diplomatic clashes with Great Britain, a conflict that already happened in our own history in May 1945, when French forces actually bombarded Damascus to suppress Syrian nationalists, and Churchill ordered British troops to intervene and force the French back down, badly damaging Anglo-French relations only days after victory in Europe had been declared. The National Front government won't want to climb down this time, which could plausibly produce an actual, albeit brief, Anglo-French military standoff over the Levant. Eventually, with American intervention, though, it's likely that France would lose these territories in the Middle East. As the dust settles, France proper would also witness its closest brush to a real Liberation-era civil war, just with the sides reversed, because in our own history, the actual danger of a communist seizure of power in liberated France in 1944 was real enough to worry the Americans, but it never materialized, largely because Maurice Thorez, the leader of the French Communist Party, who was returning from exile in Moscow that November with amnesty from de Gaulle, took Stalin's advice and pushed the French Communist Party toward the goal of one state, one army, one police, ordering the partisan militias to disarm and fold into the regular army rather than hold on to their weapons. Stalin actually didn't want a French Revolution complicating his diplomatic position at the Yalta Conference. In this scenario, however, a Kremlin, watching the National Front government reassert its control, might actually calculate that backing an armed insurrection is now more useful than restraining one, especially once the lines of the Cold War start hardening anyway by 1946. Either way, the National Front likely wins because it holds the state, the heavy weapons, the trained soldiers, and the Anglo-American logistics, while the partisans are just fighting with whatever they've kept hidden since 1940. But it's also a historical inversion of France's actual post-war violence called the épuration légale, which roughly means purification, a series of extrajudicial killings of German collaborators whose numbers ran in the low thousands. Here, if a purge comes at all, it would sort of come from the other direction, because it would be the government doing the purging, and perhaps also the left that would continue to be treated as an enemy, even if not the primary one. This uneasy partnership between Delaroque's PSF and Doriot's harder-edged PPF would also face a real test once there were no more outsider enemies left to target, and no more popular front left-wingers in power to blame, even with victory in the Second World War behind their sails. The parallel worth drawing here is to Mussolini's own management of the squadristi once he left office, or Hitler's purge of the SA leadership in 1934. Coalition governments in these more authoritarian settings have a documented tendency to turn on their own more radical wings once those wings' usefulness in the street muscle and revolutionary energy becomes a liability rather than an asset. Doriot's working-class, semi-insurrectionary PPF base is exactly that kind of internal rival to a consolidating de la Roque, who would now be sitting atop the actual apparatus of the state, with the army and the interior minister both likely answering to a government he probably now officially leads. Zooming out, however, this alternate post-war order shifts the entire moral and political landscape of the era. A victorious, highly militarized, anti-communist National Front in France, a surviving fascist government in Italy that's not necessarily seen as an overt enemy, and likewise the continued existence of Franco's government in Spain and Antonio de Oliveira Salazar's Estado Novo in Portugal makes ideology a transactional thing for the Western Allies. The nature of the post-war institutions like the United Nations and Bretton Woods system, the diplomatic vocabulary the West is using, and the dynamics of the early Cold War would all have to adjust to accommodate this new political reality. To seat the French at the UN Security Council and the Nuremberg and Geneva trials, these Western diplomats would have to construct a deliberate ideological firewall, and one that includes fascism. This alternate timeline would produce a clear distinction between German National Socialism and fascism. National Socialism would be uniquely aggressive, racialist, and totalitarian, a German ideology. Fascism, with the term fascism in this timeline likely becoming more of an umbrella term for Italian fascism, Francoism, or French government's ideology, etc., would be state Catholic and corporatist, anti-Bolshevik and defensive, and eventually brought into the camp, albeit begrudgingly, of the anti-communist NATO alliance. Churchill and the new American president, Harry S. Truman, would essentially be forced to argue that while the National Front, Franco, and Mussolini were non-democratic, they were statist and order-oriented, not apocalyptic expansionists. France and Italy resisted German hegemony, maintained stable borders, and in Italy's case fought against Soviet expansionism. This is, once again, pure realpolitik. America and Britain, no matter how much disdain they begin to carry for this French government complicating the post-war order, would need them at the table to fight this looming Cold War with the communist bloc. Now, the distinction between National Socialism and fascism, of course, directly insulates Mussolini's non-belligerent Italy from being lumped in with Nazi Germany. Italy would be allowed to, over the coming decades, transition smoothly into a conservative, post-Mussolini, corporatist republic without ever undergoing defascistization. There is one important thing to point out, though. Once the Nazi death camps in Poland and Germany are fully liberated and documented in 1945, this rhetorical distinction would suffer some moral strain. The National Front, as we mentioned, passed its own questionable laws. However, because the French government was in exile in Algiers and actively fighting Germany, the mass deportations of French Jews to extermination camps would have occurred under German direction, not by a French collaborationist government. The National Front would just frame its pre-war legislation as sovereign civic restrictions or anti-communist state security measures, and the British and Americans would simply allow these laws to be quietly repealed between 1945 and 1947 as a condition for Marshall Plan aid, sweeping the internal persecutions of Jews in France under the rug in the name of Allied unity. As the Cold War begins, the Western Bloc would be a much different place. France would be an assertive participant in Bretton Woods, demanding protection for its colonial Frank zone and state-directed industrial planning. NATO would not be established as a defensive alliance of liberal democracies, but strictly as an anti-Soviet military coalition. Because of this, it would fold in France, Italy, and Portugal, and perhaps eventually Spain, without issue. The National Front would suppress anti-colonial uprisings in Algeria and Madagascar with uncompromising military force, perhaps even extending aid to the Portuguese, who were fighting their own colonial wars. Indochina is probably the sharpest example of how different this Cold War looks from our own. Historically, the French return to Vietnam in 1945 was a walk into chaos. A 1945 Japanese coup had already dissolved what remained of the collaborationist Vichy colonial administration, leaving a power vacuum that Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh filled almost immediately, declaring independence that September before French troops could get back in force. Then we saw a slow, politically divided French effort, first attempting negotiation before stumbling into the First Indochina War by December 1946, with an underfunded, war-exhausted colonial army that took 8 years to lose at Dien Bien Phu. However, this timeline's Indochina was already fully lost outright to Japanese conquest, rather than administered as a nominally sovereign client for most of the war. So there's no in-place colonial apparatus for anyone to inherit in 1945, just a Japanese occupation and whatever Viet Minh organizing happened underneath it. Simultaneously, the France reconquering it in 1945 is nothing like the exhausted, divided republic of our own history. It has built and equipped a large colonial army with American material during the war, and again, by the nature of its ideology, will refuse to negotiate colonial independence with anyone, let alone a communist movement. Whether this alternate France crushes the Viet Minh or just produces a longer, uglier war fought with better weapons on both sides is a bit more of an open question. But either way, there's a real case that this timeline never needs an American entry at all. America was already deep in the business of bankrolling authoritarian allies as the Cold War took shape, and thus could simply keep funding a French war in Southeast Asia the way it funded the real one from 1950 onward, without ever needing in this timeline to send its own ground troops to finish the job, because this France would be committed to finishing the job regardless, even if it cripples them politically at home. On that note, however, the most important outcome of all of this, in my opinion, is that, as we mentioned, fascism would simply survive well into the 20th century as an accepted, normalized component of the Western sphere. It probably will not necessarily survive intact, because the kind of autarkic, state-directed economics that fascism was built around were more suited to the interwar years than the post-war ones. Franco's Spain, which again I'm aware was not fascist, in our own history spent its first 2 decades in economic stagnation under that kind of corporatist planning, and only saw real growth after the 1959 stabilization plan, when technocrats were allowed to abandon autarky and run a more liberalized economic policy, while the political system stayed closed. So perhaps the politics stayed authoritarian considerably longer than the economics stayed corporatist. But either way, for some time in the early Cold War, the Western sphere would no longer be fully capitalist, but rather an amalgamation of capitalist, corporatist, syndicalist, and technocratic states. And because fascism would have survived, Nazism would be an extinguished, singular, unique heresy. It would have been uniquely genocidal, uniquely expansionist, and properly buried by a coalition of world powers from all sides of the political spectrum. And if fascism is just another such side, perhaps slightly distasteful to its liberal Western allies, but an accepted one nonetheless, then the entire post-war moral vocabulary we have all inherited never gets built. Liberal intellectuals like Francis Fukuyama would never have their end of history, because history never would have offered a definitive victory for liberal democracy. Instead, the 20th century would end as it began, with an armed, pragmatic truce between rival forms of power, and a world where total state control is not a disgraced method of governance, but simply one more seat at the table. But that's where I'll be leaving this scenario for today. Be sure to check out Rewriting History's channel and his very entertaining video answering the same question of a fascist France in a very different way. As always, let me know what you think will happen next. If you enjoyed this video or have any critiques or notes, be sure to leave a comment for the algorithm and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. You can support us by joining our Discord or by becoming a channel member with the join button below. Thanks for your time. This has been the Yosef Z, signing out.